Hey, I'm Owen and today we're going to be stepping back in time to the 1970s to build this retro Airfix Hawker Hurricane Mark IV. Before starting, I washed all the parts in warm soapy water with a splash of vinegar to remove any residue which may prevent the paint from sticking to the plastic. As to be expected with a kit of this age, the cockpit contains no detail whatsoever. Thankfully though, the kit comes with quite a well moulded pilot figure, and when he's in place he covers up a lot of the bare surfaces. I decided not to glue the cockpit parts together on one half of the fuselage as the instructions suggested, because I could see a better way of doing it. Instead, I joined the two fuselage halves and put the cockpit parts in from underneath. This ensured that they sat in the correct positions. So some of you may have noticed my mistake. I've glued the fuselage together without putting the propeller in, so this means no spinny propeller for me. It's just going to have to be glued in later. When I accidentally get excess glue on the model, I clean it up straight away with a piece of paper or tissue. I dab up the glue with the tissue instead of wiping it. A wiping motion could spread the glue across the surface of the model and create more mess. Before gluing the wings together, I needed to drill out these holes with a pin vise because I wanted to add the underwing fuel tanks to this model. If you're building this kit and don't want to add any bombs, rockets, cannons or fuel tanks, don't drill out these holes. I used clothes pegs to hold the parts in place while the glue dried. Okay, so it's come to the part in the build where I've got to decide if I want to build it with the landing gear up or down. It does come with this rather fetching stand, and I want to put my pilot in the cockpit because I think he's a cool little dude. So I'm going to build it with the landing gear up. So let's get on with that. The kit comes with the options of adding bombs, cannons, rockets or fuel tanks under the wings. I decided to add the fuel tanks. The two halves of the fuel tanks have locator pins which are supposed to help you line the parts up properly when you join them. However, in this case they didn't line up. To fix this, I cut off the locator pins which allowed me to align the two halves correctly. Although I aligned the two halves as well as I could, there were still join seams. I removed these by sanding the joins first with 400 grit sandpaper and then 1000 grit sandpaper to get a nice smooth finish. There were very large gaps along the wing roots which needed to be filled. I used Deluxe Materials Perfect Plastic Putty to fill the gaps. Perfect Plastic Putty can be cleaned up with water before it dries, so I easily wiped away any mess with a damp sponge. I made sure to wear a dust mask when sanding so that I didn't breathe in any small plastic particles. To make sure that all the join seams had been successfully removed, I painted a medium grey colour over them. Upon closer inspection, it was apparent that more work needed to be done. I repeated the sanding process until all the join seams disappeared. So I'm now happy with all of the filling and sanding on this model, and it's time to move on to the painting. Now I thought I'd take this opportunity to answer one of the questions that I've always been asked, which is, can you brush paint with paints that are designed for airbrushes? So I've bought some Model Air and some Hawker paint, which are both designed for airbrushes, and I'm going to give them a try out on this model. But I've also bought Hawker's Blue Line set, which is designed for paintbrushes, so I'm also going to give that a go. So I'm excited to see what the results are. I started by painting Vallejo Model Air Medium Sea Grey on the underside of the starboard wing. This paint is optimised for airbrushes and is very thin, so I applied the paint straight from the pot to the model without mixing in any thinners. Next, I tested Hurricane medium sea grey on the underside of the port wing. Again, this paint is optimised for airbrushes, so is already very thin, so I applied it to the model straight from the pot. Finally, I tested the Hurricane Blue Line medium sea grey, which is a paint optimised for paintbrushes. I decided to apply this colour straight from the pot without thinning it, just to see what the results would be. I repeated this process with a second coat of each colour on the underside. I gave the top side of the plane 2 coats of ocean grey. Note that I'm using a 2 cm wide flat brush on large surface areas such as the wings and a 1 cm wide round brush on the fuselage. Using the largest brush possible on a surface will help you to reduce visible brush strokes. After the second coat of ocean grey had fully dried, it was time to paint the green camouflage pattern. On the port wing, I tested Vallejo Model Air Dark Green, which is optimised for airbrushes. Around the fuselage of the model, I tested the Hurricane Blue Line Dark Green. I painted all of the camouflage pattern freehand using a small rounded brush. The small rounded brush allows me to paint the undulating shapes more easily than if I had been using any other shaped brush, for example, a flat brush. It's important to choose the right brush size and shape depending on what you are painting. On the starboard wing, I tested the Hurricane Dark Green, which is optimised for airbrushes. At this point, I'd like to talk about my experiences with the different types of paint. The Vallejo Model Air, optimised for airbrushes, was not easy to brush paint with. It was extremely thin, which meant it required loads of coats, so I wouldn't recommend it for brush painting. And once dry, it had a satin finish rather than a matte finish. The airbrush optimised Hurricane paint was the same, it dried with a satin finish. However, I did find that it was not so incredibly thin as the Model Air colours, and I would say that you could probably brush paint with it. Hurricane's Blue Line paint was a clear winner though. It had great coverage and a surprisingly good consistency. Although I applied it to the model without thinners, it gave a nice smooth finish and dried with a matte result. This Blue Line paint is possibly my new favourite paint. After removing the masking tape, I carefully touched up some bits of the paintwork with a fine brush to ensure that everything looked neat and tidy. Next, I had to paint the yellow strips on the leading edges of the wings. I masked off the area with Tamiya masking tape. First, I applied a base coat of light grey, but I'd recommend using white paint if you have some. This will give the yellow a stronger colour when painted on top. So I thought that because I've got this Humbrol acrylic yellow and also this Model Air yellow, I'd give them a little test. I know it's only on a small surface area along the leading edges of the wings, but you know, I'm being experimental, might as well give it a go. The Humbrol yellow had a much stronger pigment than the Vallejo Model Air yellow, and so required less coats. However, I did find that the Humbrol yellow was a lot more gritty, suggesting that the pigment hadn't been ground up properly. Once the Humbrol yellow had dried, I had to smooth it down with sandpaper to remove the lumps. Once the masking tape had been removed, I again neatened up any mess with a very fine brush. Okay, so I've had a haircut and it's now time to put the decals on. The kit did come with this set of decals for the Mark IV Hurricane, however they're a bit yellowed. I know that you can stick them on a window for a bit and the UV light will make them unyellowed? De-yellowed? Don't think that's a word, but you get what I mean. So I'm going to try that, but I'm concerned that they may be a bit fragile even when they are de-yellowed. So I've also gone and bought these aftermarket decals from Extra Decal from Hannett's, but they are D-Day ones, so they're for a Hurricane Mark IIc. So I'm in a bit of dilemma here. I think I'm just going to go ahead and stick them on. I'm not too fussed about exact historical accuracy. Feel free to hate on me in the comment section below. Anyway, I'm just going to put these on. I decanted Humbrol decal fix into a tub and let the decals soak for about 2 minutes, or until the decals began to slide freely on the transfer paper. I then applied Humbrol decal fix to the area of the model where I wanted the decal to go, and carefully slid the decal off the transfer paper and into place on the model. If you are not using Humbrol decal fix, I'd recommend that you apply a gloss coat to the model before you apply the decals, as this will prevent a nasty effect called silvering. However, the new formula of Humbrol decal fix means that a gloss coat is not required. Another technique that I have found helpful is to score around the printed areas of the decals to remove the excess clear film. Removing the excess clear film does make the decals more fragile, so you have to take much more care when applying them to the model. However, it does reduce the chances of silvering occurring and helps the decals blend with the model's surface. To score the decals neatly, I use a piece of Dymo tape to guide my scalpel. After soaking the decals, I then brush away the excess clear film before applying the decal to the model. Okay, so I've left these decals overnight to conform to the model. However, they're having a bit of a hard time because of all the rivet detail that's raised on the kit. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to apply a little bit more decal solution over them, wait for them to soften up, and then very gently with a damp paper towel just apply a little bit of pressure, very gently, to try and help them conform. Once the decals had fully dried, I glued on some of the smaller parts that I had left off. I had left these off until now to reduce the risk of me accidentally knocking them off or damaging them earlier in the process. To create gun smoke and exhaust stains on the model, I first collected some black and brown chalk dust by scraping my knife along some artist's chalk pastels. Then, with a fine brush, I applied black chalk to the model to create gun smoke stains. I did the same with black and brown chalk dust to create exhaust smoke stains. To learn more about this technique, click the link in the description or in the top right corner of the video. Spraying the model with a coat of matte varnish sealed in the weathering and the decals and helped unify the paintwork by removing the satin sheen from the airbrush optimised paints. So for these clear parts, I'm going to try something that I haven't used before, and I've treated myself to some Johnson's Pledge floor polish. So I'm going to use this on them and see how this goes. I decanted some floor polish into a container and dipped the clear parts into it, making sure they were fully coated. I then tapped off the excess, placed them inside an airtight container and put them in a safe place to dry. After being left to dry for at least 24 hours, you can see that the floor polish greatly improves the clarity of the clear parts. I started painting the frames with a very fine brush, trying to be as neat as possible. To make it easier to hold, I stuck the canopy on some blue tack to make a handle. Once the paint had dried, I neatened up any mess with a sharpened piece of sprue, but you could use a sharpened matchstick or a cocktail stick. I glued in the pilot figure, followed by the cockpit canopy. I glued the canopy on with PVA glue because it dries clear and doesn't attack the plastic. Finally, the landing lights were glued into the wings with PVA glue and the stand was attached. With that, the model was completed. So overall, I was actually pleasantly surprised by this kit. The parts all fitted. I mean, they weren't as bad as I thought they were going to be, and the plastic was good quality. The detail is obviously a bit lacking and also raised. I mean, I don't know if it's just me, but I actually quite like the raised detail. Don't know if that's just me. The extra decal set was great. They were very well printed and very thin, so although that means that they conformed well to the model and look good when they're finished, it does make them quite fragile when you're putting them on, so just be careful with those. And I love this display stand that it comes with. Maybe that's why I just like this model so much, is just for the stand, I don't know. Now, I definitely know that I've not done a perfect job on this kit. I can see a lot of ways in which I could have improved, but you know what, I actually don't really care because I just really enjoyed making it. I might actually come back to it in the future and add a bit of colour modulation with oil paints, and also potentially swap out the fuel tanks for the cannons or the bombs, I'm not sure. But for now, I ran out of time, and so unfortunately I'm just going to have to leave it as it is. So I hope that you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed building this kit, this weird, slightly rubbish kit. And if you did, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on more videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.